This is Brandon M. Crooker, and you're listening to the Apostolic Theory Podcast. Welcome back to Apostolic Theory. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. We have a very special guest with us. We have Ryan Franklin with us, just an exceptional minister, really, if you've ever heard him preach. He's a tremendous minister of the gospel. He's an author, a podcaster. I'll let him get into all that. Go ahead, tell listeners a bit about you, and we'll get into the questions and the conversation.
Hey, sir. So good to see you today and be able to interact with you a little bit. I appreciate you inviting me on to your podcast. Just to tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, I'm the husband to one wife, Angie, and I have two teenage kids, Olivia and Neil, 17 and 14. And that's my priority. If you're thinking about a priority list of things that I do in life, that is the greatest priority in my life. But I also do a ton of other things. I'm an assistant pastor at the Pentecostals of Alexandria, and love the day-to-day interactions of work and leadership and ministry. I do a lot of the behind-the-scenes work at POA, from preaching to teaching, but also a lot of the counseling and leading of ministries behind the scenes. So thoroughly enjoy that. But in addition to that, I do executive coaching, where I work with leaders of all kinds, primarily pastors and church leaders. Also have a few business clients, but all Christian biblical related leaders that I want to invest my time and energy into. And that's something that brings a lot of joy to me. And so I do a one-on-one practice, but I also have a community coaching program as well. And we can talk about that a little bit later if you want to hear any additional things about that. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Sounds like you're a pretty busy guy. Just ministry alone seems like that's got you fairly busy, and then you have these other things that you're involved in and doing for the kingdom of God. And I actually didn't realize that you had a executive coaching business, and that's I'm definitely going to be interested in talking a little bit about that. But first, I'd like to discuss your podcast. Now, I actually discovered your podcast probably a year ago, and it was just really, I was like, this is good stuff. I was like, this is impactful. This is necessary. It's needful. It's the content is just for this generation. It's just what we need, and it's great to have a podcast on leadership, Christian leadership, that we can have that easy access to. But I want you to tell us a little bit about your podcast, a little bit about where it was birthed, where it came from, what caused you to start it, and just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, when I originally started working on it, it was, sort of birthed out of a desire to want to speak to some of the specific topics that I felt the Lord was calling me to speak to. I had developed a model that I call the Christian Leader Blueprint Model, and we can talk about that a little bit more shortly when we talk about my book, if you want to. But that's the name of my book, is a Christian Leader Blueprint. But it started with a model, and so I did the podcast so that I could start addressing the topics within that model. There's 16 topics in the model, and I felt like that they were critical for a Christian leader to develop, things that I would see in Scripture, things that I would see even that was confirmed even in neuroscience and various things that I would study. But really, if you really want to get down to it, I started the podcast to help fulfill that God-given calling within me to make disciples of Christ. I wanted to help others be more effective in making disciples of Christ, to sort of do my part to progress the kingdom of God. And I felt since I was 16, 17 years old, I was receiving the John Maxwell Tape Club, Leadership Tape Club monthly subscription. Even from way back then, I've just had a love and a joy for leadership. And so this was just an avenue to sort of get into that even more and help do my part to drive the cause of the gospel. And I just ultimately, with the podcast, I want to help Christian leaders who are sharing the gospel to become more healthy and effective. And that's bottom line.
That's awesome. And as you mentioned, you developed this book. So probably, and maybe it was through the different sessions of you sharing, your experiences and your studies and things of that nature. But you mentioned your book, The Christian Leadership Blueprint. Tell us about that and kind of how long it took you to write it, for anybody that's interested in writing, and I feel like a lot of people that write struggle with, or want to write, struggle with actually committing to it, because they have this idea that who would want to read what I have to write, and I don't know if that's something you struggled with, but tell us a little bit about
100%.
that process.
100%. Yeah, that's we would label that in psychology as the imposter syndrome, and I absolutely went through that and still go through that even to this day, every now and then. But especially with the book, who am I to write a leadership book? And I had to get to a place where I was just, where I just had to tell myself, if the Lord truly gave me this model, and it's something that can help Christian leaders in a tremendous way, especially apostolic Christian leaders, then who am I to not write this book? If the Lord gave it to me, I got to get it out there.
Yeah.
And even if it was, 2 people that read it, maybe the Lord wanted me to get it out there to help those 2 people. And I had to get to a place where I was willing to show up and do what the Lord was telling me to do, regardless of how many people were there. And that's really the fear, is, will anybody read my book? And am I going to do all this work? But I got to a place where the Lord eventually told me, Ryan, minister to the people that I put in front of you. And so that's what I've been doing for years now, is just ministering to the people that the Lord put in front of me. And one of the ways of doing that was through this book, and began to work on this book. It took me, you asked how long, it was 2 years of writing. It's a pretty lengthy book. It's a comprehensive book. I've been told that it's sort of like a textbook in some form or fashion, and it truly is. There's a lot of meat in it, and it's not something to just sit down and read quickly. It's something that is probably better read a little bit at a time, over time, because it's very meaty. But yes, it took me about 2 years to write it, another year to actually publish it. I went through a hybrid publisher where where I retained the rights, but they did all of the work. It was quite costly, but it was, I wanted to be done. I knew this was not just a fly-by-night book that I would just move past really quickly. I knew the Lord had given me this model, and I had some other vision and dreams with it that He had given me as well. So I wanted it to be the best that it possibly could. So I went through this hybrid publisher that took a lot of time and effort in editing and all of the details of making it the best that it possibly could be.
Yeah.
Anything there before I keep going? Because I could keep going and kind of tell you what led me to write the book and
go
that
for
sort
it.
of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So I saw really, I was seeing people just haphazardly attend seminars, read books, take courses, just consuming material.
Yeah.
But there was still like a disconnect. Like even in my own life, I was consuming tons of material. I'm a reader, studier. I'm always taking some kind of course. I've got multiple degrees. I mean, I'm always consuming, but there was still a disconnect, and I was just trying to figure out how can I better prepare the leaders, even at POA, to be able to step up and lead it and be effective and healthy at the same time. And so that's what drew me down. That's what drew me to the model, first of all. And that's what really led me to write the book. And, reality is that life is just too short and time is too short to not be laser focused on what's going to move the needle in your life. And I wanted to develop something that could help a person know exactly what would create healthy and effective leadership. And that's what you get in this book. It's more than just the content. It's a model. And I've even got a self-assessment. It's free on my website that will help you zero in on exactly. There's 16 topics in the blueprint, divided up into 4 areas. And that self-assessment on my website, ryanfranklin.org, you can go on there, you can take that assessment. It will allow you to zero in on the top 2 to 3 things that will move the needle in your life the quickest. And so then you can go to the book, read those chapters, and engage in the material. Not only that, if you exhaust the material in the book, you use it as a template. So if, let's say, just to give you an example, if healthy life balance is something that a person is really struggling with and they exhaust the material in the book, well, you go get another book on healthy life balance. I even have some suggestions of books and things of that nature. But you gear your training, your book reading, all of those things along this model, and it just deepens and really compounds the growth that a person would have in their life.
Yeah.
So.
And I actually, speaking of, this sort of template that you can utilize. Obviously, this isn't just something that you put together. It seems to me, at least from what I read in it, it seemed to me like this was birthed out of experience and different things that you've gone through in each of the different sections and portions. And so I wonder if you would, what has your personal experience been in your own leadership transformation as it is in regards to these different sections that you put together in the book?
Absolutely, definitely birthed out of my own experiences. And back in 2016, we had a big transition at POA. One of our associate pastors that had been here for many, many years, I had served him as his assistant for many years, decided that transition was time, and he took a different path. And all of a sudden, I was kind of put in a spot that I felt completely inadequate to do, and that was an assistant pastor here. And I started leading tons of ministries that I had assisted with, but the buck had never stopped with me. And even the counseling that I sort of inherited, I just was completely inadequate with. And so I was juggling all of these things, inadequate at doing it, just trying to figure it all out. I was in the middle of a master's degree program at the time, and so it just all just compounding, and I was frustrated. I was at a place where I was burning out, and I can remember a particular Tuesday afternoon. I just felt like I had hit a wall, like I was done, and I just felt that burnt out. And I cried out to the Lord. It was after a staff meeting one day on a Tuesday. I cried out to the Lord and I said, Lord, you have got to help me. And that night, that day, I reached out to a friend, really haphazardly because I didn't have a lot of support in my life at the time. But I reached out to a friend. He was willing to help and helped me through that period of time. Shortly after, I ended up getting my first, experiencing my first executive coach. It was crazy expensive, but I didn't care because it was, I either had to figure out how to pay for it and move forward with it, or I was done. And so got my executive coach, and he started working through systematically some things in my life. And, um, you know, first of all, it started with a healthy life balance. I was working to establish a healthy life balance, and that was a lot of things in my life, from from my work life balance to my vision in my life to routines and goals and character development in my life. That was the first pillar of the blueprint, and the first thing that I started working on in my life. And then see yourself more clearly. That's the second pillar of the Christian Leader Blueprint, which is getting a clarity of mind, emotional intelligence, which emotional intelligence is an umbrella to a lot of things within the blueprint. However, I felt it was important to really understand that topic as a whole as well. But motivation, what's going to motivate me to do things for the long haul? Leadership derailers, things that are going to derail my leadership, understanding that about myself, overcoming a lot of those things. And then moving to the third pillar of the blueprint was leveraging my strengths, working on my gifts, understanding my gifts more, my calling more, effectively leading others. There's a few things within effectively leading others that really is a difference maker, and that's the things that I focused on in the Christian Leader Blueprint, such as conflict resolution, delegation. Those are hard things for leaders most of the time, and so those are the things that I focused on in that. But also learning how to develop leaders and other people. That was another part of the leverage your strengths. And then finally, the fourth part of the blueprint was build more productive relationships. And that's things like social intelligence, being able to be intelligent in the social settings that we are in. Regulation, self-regulation, being able to regulate the emotion within me. That is such a difficult thing, but it's a needed thing. I mean, how many times have you seen a leader just emotionally out of whack and they get angry, or they fly off the handle with their kids or their spouse or their people that they lead? It's something that you have to work on in order to have productive relationships. And then the last two parts of that is learning empathy, which is one of the most powerful tools. It's not natural to me. I'm not naturally an empathetic person, but it's one of the most powerful tools in leadership that a person can develop, and it is developable. And then the final thing is building a personal support team. Probably the hardest part of the entire Christian Leader Blueprint. It's one of the reasons I put it as the last part. But it is a something in my life that I did not have. All of these things were really things that I grew in and didn't have in my life. But this personal support team was something. I was surrounded by tons of people at POA, but I was relationally anorexic. And when I started working on a personal support team, it literally shifted things in my life. I had prayer. I had a great devotion with the Lord, but scripturally, He tells us to bear one another's burdens. Over 60 times we see one another's scriptures in the Bible, and it talks about getting in one another's lives and helping one another. And when I started building that personal support team, it was really just a game changer in my life, and really helped me move to a place where I was becoming much more effective. So that's the model there. It didn't surface in my life exactly like that. It was, learning here or there and processing things in my life here or there, and it was all over the place. It was kind of messy, But when I sat down and I started graphing these things out, and I started seeing these things in my own with my own clients, because that's another part of my story. After experiencing an executive coach, I knew I had to become one. It was that life-changing, and I knew I wanted to help others with life-changing things as mine did. And so I went that route. A couple of years in, I started seeing these patterns, same patterns that I experienced. And as I started graphing, I'm a big nerd when it comes to that kind of stuff. And I started graphing things and big whiteboards and trying to make sense of all of this. And that's when the model of the Christian Leader Blueprint sort of surfaced, and started working on it from there.
So through your experience, and you've experienced people coming in and helping you kind of really pinpoint the different things in your life that you were having issues with, executive coaches, and then you became one yourself. And so obviously you've had some experience in your own life and in the other lives of other people, whether it was with your executive coach business or as an assistant pastor in counseling and helping people in ministry, or even just the laity, the people in the church. But so as far as leadership is concerned, and I'm sure there's some things that you've noticed, and maybe we could say it with your opinion, or maybe it's just kind of your observation. But what would you say would be the most or the greatest struggle that the leadership in the Apostolic Church is dealing with right now?
Yeah, great question, and that's not an easy question to answer. That's a complicated one, and I really think that's why leadership actually feels so complicated for most people, because it's not an easy answer. And the reality of it is every leader experiences different shortcomings, which is quite challenging for a leader who is developing leaders to try to figure that out. And so it's which is one of the reasons why, if you look in my book and you see a diagram of the model, it's in a Venn diagram, because it all overlaps. It's interesting that all of these things, that if you're working on one, you're going to help the other parts of it. If you're struggling in one, it's going to make you struggle in other parts of the blueprint. And so it's all sort of intertwined together. But I think if I had to pinpoint it down to one thing, is, believe it or not, and you'd be surprised, but most leaders struggle with developing productive relationships. And it's interesting how much pastors who are leading people, leading congregations, leading teams of people, they really struggle to produce effective relationships. And here's the even bigger problem. They're surrounded by tons of people, but they're lonely. And when I say lonely, it doesn't mean that they have lots of interaction with people, but I mean that deep, life-giving interaction with people is non-existent in a lot of leaders. And I would say probably 90% of the people that I do executive coaching with, that's one of the first things that I see in people's lives, is that they're lonely. They're surrounded by people, but people can only get so far. They create that wall, that barrier, and there's a cost when you have a barrier between you and people. And that's the Lord designed it to where people in our lives are a great regulator for us. And stress, even though people may create stress, we also need people to reduce stress in our life. And even you introverts out there, I'm deeply introverted. And yes, I need my alone time, but when I've recuperated and got my alone time, I need people in my life that I can get close to, and that I can draw relational nutrients from, that's going to keep me happy and healthy and relationally full.
Absolutely. And so, you know, in talking about this process of personal growth and spiritual growth and leadership growth, um, where does leadership fit in this, in a model for how a church can uh, grow its own leaders, its own disciples, and things of that nature, and how that, like, how important is the leadership role, and maybe what are some things. Well, let's tackle it. That probably maybe a B question, but so as a leader, how important is the leadership role in church growth, whether it's spiritual, whether it's the physical growth, more people coming into the church, and its sustainability.
Yeah. That's easy. It's everything. You're not going to grow a church unless you establish leadership within the church. And there's only so far you can. And I see all the time, I see people who have tapped out in their ability to influence people. There's only so many people that Ryan can influence. There's only so many people that Brandon can influence. It's we're going to tap out. And so if we don't establish a structure of leadership, um, it limits the growth of the church and limits the number of people that your ministry, your church is going to be able to reach. And um, I would say Scripture absolutely confirms this right off the bat. The Acts chapter 2 was the birth of the church. Guess what? Acts chapter 6 talks about leadership and delegation. And the beginning of the church, the actual church structure, would have never happened had they not invested in leadership and delegation and all of the faucets of leadership.
What are some tips and some pointers that you would give people in leadership that want to um, grow or transform their own leadership, or be examples of that transformation that can take place in the leadership roles?
Yeah. I would say, first of all, the individual needs to get laser focused and create a vision for where and what they need to head towards in their leadership. And quit the haphazard development where you're just grabbing this book here or this course here, or let's stop that. Let's get laser focused and get a plan for growth, because a plan is going to allow the leader to capitalize and build and continue to work towards something that will create significant results in that leader's life. So that would be the first tip that I would give. And the second tip I would give is that neuroscience will tell you that some of the hardwired things in our brain, the things that are leadership derailers, the barriers that we create in leadership, like just to give you an example, like maybe I'm struggling with passive aggressive behavior, or maybe I'm struggling with perfectionism, or egotism, or maybe I'm negative all the time, or I detach from people. All of those things, you're not going to change those things unless you are in the context of a relationship. Neuroscience will tell you that, but guess what? I could give you scriptural examples. Scripture confirms what neuroscience is just now learning. It's amazing. But I would say that one of the greatest tips that I could give somebody is find a community of people that are growing in the direction that you want to grow in, and embrace them and love them, allow them to love you as you're growing the internal of yourself. If you think about it, a lot of these negative aspects of our leadership that we're trying to grow through were created because of negative things in relationships, right? So it would make sense that you've got to be in the context of positive, good relationships in order to grow out of and heal those things that may be holding us back as a leader, if that makes sense. So that would be my top two tips and things that I would recommend for a person.
Yeah, and that is very well said. It really is. We're hitting the that half hour mark. What is one thing they've listened to us kind of talk back and forth, some cues and some questions, some answers? What is one thing they've listened this long that you want them to walk away from this episode with?
Well, outside of those two tips, and those two tips are the most important things in my mind. That would be get laser focused and find a community that you can engage in. And by the way, as I mentioned, I have the self-assessment that will help get a person laser focused. I also have a community that people can resource from. But if it's not my community, find a community somewhere that will help you in that regard. But don't underestimate the power of relationships in your life. That would be the important thing that I would say. We need certain things in our life in order to be relationally present with people. This church business, pastoring, working, even if you're not a pastor, if you're just working with as a church leader somewhere, you have got to be able to work with people, right? You've got to be able to give relationally to people. Yeah. And we've got to figure out how to receive relationally as well. It's not just logical learning. Leadership growth is not just about logically learning. It's about receiving the things and actually learning how to receive the things that we really desperately need in order to be full and healthy and ready to lead in a way that is going to move the needle in our churches and in people's lives.